When you talk about layoffs, like those are actual people, 30,000 or whatever that number is. It's like, that's how many people are affected. That's how many families are affected. And so super terrible situation.
Today, we have the absolute pleasure of chatting with Steve Huynh, who is an ex-Amazon principal software engineer. This is a level that only 1.5% of engineers ever get to. Steve spent 18 years at Amazon, led some of their major engineering initiatives, and gave over 850 interviews. Why did you decide to stay at specifically Amazon for 18 years?
I just really like pain.
Hi, friends. Today, we have the absolute pleasure of chatting with Steve Huynh, who is an ex-Amazon principal software engineer. This is a level that only 1.5% of engineers ever get to. Steve spent 18 years at Amazon, led some of their major engineering initiatives, and gave over 850 interviews. Today, we're going to be talking about how to get to Steve's level as a principal software engineer and how to perform well and exceed expectations as a software engineer. So let's get into it. Thank you so much for being on my channel, Steve. It's a pleasure to talk to you. Can you tell me a bit about how you ended up at Amazon and what your career progression has been at Amazon?
Sure. Yeah, I really wanted to be a writer, and that didn't work out because I wanted to make money. And so, I had done some computer science. I did the computer science AP tests back when it was in Pascal and C++. And so I knew a little bit about data structures and algorithms. I took a couple courses when I was in college. But, when I got out of school, I realized there wasn't that big of a delta between like me getting a job in big tech, on my engineering merits, than I think just a random person. And so I was able to use some of my connections to get a job as a support engineer. And then from there, I was able to get into software development.
Oh, very cool. How did you transition from being a support engineer to becoming a software engineer?
Yeah, so it turns out when you get your foot in the door at a company, you get access to all of this information. So most companies, you can check code out. There's a big internal wiki system, and you can just talk to a bunch of coworkers. So if you just make friends with people, they'll tell you what they asked during interviews, and they'll give you mock interviews. And so I was just this really big sponge of information. The way I put it is basically I just let my curiosity lead the way. And so it turns out if you want to know how recommendation systems work at Amazon, or if you want to know how their product search works, or whatever it is, you can just go and look that up. And just by default, there's an open culture within the company. I don't think that's true of every company, but I will say that once you get into a particular company, there's quite a bit that you can learn if you just roll your sleeves up.
I'm curious because I know for Google, where I used to work, similarly, there's a very open culture and you can look at most code, but there are some places that are siloed. Did you see that at Amazon as well?
Yeah, there's certainly places where there's some secret sauce and they just don't let anybody in. But I think just by default, everything's open.
Cool. And you mentioned that you were at Amazon for 18 years, right? I know that a lot of my friends and a lot of other people in the industry do jump from company to company. Why did you decide to stay at specifically Amazon for 18 years? And if you had to do it all over, would you choose to do so again?
Yeah, I just really like pain. So, I think obviously, you're not always 100% happy with where you work. But the thing about me is I think I'm pretty happy as long as I'm growing and I'm getting pushed and I'm learning and I'm working around really awesome people. And so, say what you will about Amazon, but they employ some of the smartest people that I've ever met. And so whenever there was a period in time where I didn't like the team, I could just move, right? So I've worked in many, many different teams within the company.
What are some of the products that you've worked on?
Yeah, I worked on Search Inside the Book. I worked on Kindle. I worked on Prime Video. I worked for Amazon Tickets, which was our sort of Ticketmaster thing. I worked for a long time in payments. So I've just been all over the retail side of the company. I didn't even go to AWS, but the company is just so large that there's a ton of different places that you can work.
When did you know that it was time to switch teams when you were switching from, for example, when you were going into payments?
Yeah, I think it depends on the particular circumstance, but, when you feel like you're not learning anything, it's really easy to go. I just had this fear of stagnating. There's the technology just changes so quickly, and there's just so many different things that you can learn. And so if you're just doing the same thing over and over again, I was just, if you're in Java, it's just like you're transforming one Pojo into another Pojo. And then it's from the API object to the middle object to the database object and then back. And then you're doing that on a couple layers. You're just like, what am I doing? Like, I was not put on this earth to like transform Pojos from one form to another. Then you're like, oh, well, we can just generalize this. But then they're like, no, don't do don't do introspection to do that. Just do it by hand. And so I don't know. There's like, you'll just know when you're not growing anymore. And so if you can't grow on, say, like the tech side, you should just move to a different team where there's something that's a little nicer. There's just so much internally. But also, you can grow in other dimensions as well. So I like to say that software is a team sport. And, you can be the Michael Jordan of software, but you can only produce as much code as one person can produce. And so that just fundamentally limits what you can do. Now, you can be really, really good and produce a lot of code. But I just found it interesting to see like how big and complex and awesome of a thing that you could do with many people if you were able to sort of understand like what other people's motivations were and then cross-reference that with the technology stack that you're in.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned producing code. Can you tell me a bit about how leveling at Amazon works? What exactly does it mean to be a principal software engineer at Amazon?
Yeah. So Amazon has the least or most granular, the least granular system for software developers, I think, in the industry. Essentially, it's, junior, mid, senior, and then principal. And they essentially skip the staff level. And I think the historical reason was that they thought that having like really high standards was a good thing. And so basically the jump from senior to principal is 2 levels of a jump. It's a completely different job than if you were to be a senior engineer. And I think this choice like fundamentally at Amazon, I know a ton of people that are super good and are now staff, senior staff, principal, senior principal, distinguished engineers at other companies that just couldn't make that jump from senior engineer to principal at Amazon. And so I think it was a terrible decision. And it continues to be one where there's a lot of like really, really good senior engineers at Amazon that after a couple of years are basically like, I'm done. I can just go and get compensated and have the scope that I'd like and be a staff engineer at pretty much any other company within tech.
How did you specifically make that big jump between senior and principal? What was your pinnacle project, or how did your manager sell you as a principal software engineer?
So I've talked a lot about this, but essentially it only took me 4 years to go from support engineer to senior engineer within the company. And it took me another 8 years to get promoted to principal. And so the way I did it was through a lot of turmoil and stress and scratching and clawing. And they changed the process 2 or 3 times while I was doing it. I did not get more technical. I thought that I was actually pretty good circa 2016 when I thought I was ready to go. That was about 4 years into being a senior. I thought I was ready to go to principal. So it took another 4 years after that. And
did you get promoted during the pandemic or right before?
Yeah.
Oh,
yeah.
Wow.
So Q1 of 2020 was when I got promoted to principal engineer. So that was interesting. And then, you get all the congratulations emails and we're just like sitting at home wondering whether we were going to like live or die. And, I'm still a little bitter about it because they used to do this like principal engineer offsite every year where they would just, they would fly everybody from the world like to Seattle area. And then we'd go to Sancadia, which is like, an hour and a half away, go into the middle of the woods and do a bunch of like principal engineer stuff.
What is principal engineer stuff?
I don't know because I never went. And so like they try to do this stupid like RPG thing where it was like everybody's like online. If you're close to the other character, then you can like talk to them or whatever. It was so lame.
Oh.
And then when the pandemic was over and people were back in the office and stuff, they were like, oh no, the site's only for senior principal and above. And
No.
This is so ridiculous. Anyways, the project that got me there was, it was a pretty big catalog migration for Prime Video. So basically, Prime Video catalog, which describes movies and TV shows, it was sort of like unsuitable for the things that we wanted to do, like live sports and live broadcasts and all this other stuff. And so I led an initiative to generalize it so we can do essentially any type of streaming. It doesn't have to be a TV show or movie. It sounds kind of like a trivial throwaway project, but then you realize like we are launched in 200 countries and there's so much localization that goes on. And, we work in a sort of like microservices architecture. So basically there are thousands or tens of thousands of services within Prime Video that have taken a dependency on this old representation of that we're trying to get away from. And so sort of like managing that project while there was like a crazy deadline, we were trying to launch like a live sports initiative. That was my sort of senior project. That was my principal project.
That's cool. I also want to go back to what you're saying. You got from support engineer to senior engineer in just 4 years, right? How did you get promoted so quickly and ladder transfer and do that within 4 years? Since I feel like a lot of people just going from regular software engineer, like new grad to senior, takes more than 4 years.
I think, what ends up happening is you just go as far as like when you're growing, you just grow really, really quickly. And you get to this place where you're stuck. And when you're stuck, all of the growth stops. So it's basically, so you might see like hockey stick growth, and then you hit the ceiling, and then there's some reason that you're stuck. And it's just really, really difficult to get unstuck. So I don't think there was a secret for me in terms of my growth. I think that was just like my natural growth curve. For some people, I think it takes a little bit longer. But for me, I was just, I was grinding away. I was super curious about everything. I was writing a ton of code, was staying nights and weekends, probably sacrificing, relationships a little more than I should have. But I think right when I turned senior and a little bit after that, I realized I could just let my foot off the accelerator a little bit and still get high performance reviews. I don't think it was taking my foot off the accelerator. I don't think it was taking the foot off the accelerator that was the approximate reason for the 8 years. I think it was a combination of just like changing of policy and a series of unfortunate events in terms of like my manager and, all the stuff that was going on, all of the internal politics.
Do you have any advice for engineers who want to follow your trajectory and also hopefully eventually get principal or staff? Like what are some of the tips and tricks you would give?
Yeah, absolutely. I think what it comes down to is that if you're really introspective about your areas for growth that would unlock that potential, if you're really interested in growing yourself, I think it's not a big deal. So for instance, if you think you don't learn as fast as you think you should be, that was common for me. Like for some reason, I just felt like I just learned really slow. And so I just decided that I was going to do a bunch of research into meta learning. So like learning how to learn. And so it turns out there's like a rich like research, like body of research around the science of learning. And if you just like go and read up on that literature and you actually just follow those steps, you just learn amazingly fast. And so I think that's the number one skill. It's like just go and learn how to learn as quickly as possible. You'll run into things like, spaced repetition, active recall. You'll learn about Ebbinghaus's life forgetting curve. It's actually, I think more people should just be talking about this. And so I was just counting the other day. I was like, how many languages and big frameworks have I learned over the course of my career? I think in terms of languages, it's like, depending on how you count it, like well over 20. And however many frameworks, both internal and external within Amazon. And so you just like, I think it's actually much more important to like figure out what you target much more than like, the actual act of learning a thing. And so what I like to say is like, you can learn anything in this world. If you wanted to be a doctor or a biologist or, a lawyer, you could have, right? It's just you decided to put your target into computer science. And so I think everything is figure outable. And so once you realize that, you can trust yourself to learn as long as you've identified the right target, that goes really, really far. I think where it runs out is when because of your blind spots, by definition, you can't see things that are in your blind spot, you're blind to them. And so when the things that are in your blind spots are the bottleneck for your growth, I think that's where it becomes really challenging to grow.
Do you think you ever encountered any blind spots when you were, progressing up the corporate ladder?
Yeah, absolutely. I've done a ton of interviewing, and when you want to become a bar raiser at Amazon, people are watching you interview, you're shadowing other people and they're interviewing. So it's this kind of weird spot where you actually get feedback in a situation where there's nobody to give you feedback. And so I got the feedback when I was becoming a bar raiser, which was basically like, hey, you're super clinical, dude. Like, why don't you lighten up? I'd be like, what's the big O of that algorithm? And they'd be like, n log n. And I'd be like, interesting. It's like putting a white.
Have you should have been a doctor.
Yeah, I can't handle blood and stuff, so definitely not a doctor.
I love blood.
Oh, do you? Yeah. No, so I got a lot of feedback or just around communication styles. I learned that, you don't have to be a jerk when you disagree. That took a long time. You can just disagree with somebody and still go out and have a beer with them, right? Everything for me was just when you were disagreeing with somebody, it's I just felt like I was going to flip a table or something like that. And yeah, so that was one of, a long laundry list of things where I didn't see it. But I think ultimately, as long as you have people around you that are comfortable enough to give you critical feedback and, you're receptive to that feedback, which is really difficult because people are super defensive, including myself. If you just sort of use that feedback as a gift rather than as an attack, I think you can get pretty far. But you have to know that that's a thing that's holding you back from the people that you're working with.
So being more self-aware that.
Yeah. If you ever get that question, hey, what's your biggest weakness, right? During an interview, stupid question it's there to sort of knock you off your game. The question is really hey, have you solicited or received critical feedback about your performance, and what are you doing about it? That's what that question is. And so if you are not self-aware and know that you're not a perfect human being, and you're trying to get better and understand your tendencies more, that's the whole basis of that question, right? And so I think if you want to get really good, you just need to really be honest with yourself about the areas in which you need to grow.
That's a great point. So you mentioned that you were a bar raiser for Amazon. So you must have done, more than 850 interviews, right? What are the most common mistakes that people make when trying to get a job at Amazon? And what's something that will make it much more likely for someone to get hired?
I think what people need to understand is by the time you get to the on-site interview or the final interview round, you are probably 85 to 95% qualified for the job. And so, yes, you need to code and, they're going to give you some problems that you've prepared for and some that you haven't prepared for, whether that's coding or system design. But I think that most people are treating the interview like a test. And I think it's much more like a date because the company is looking for somebody because they have a specific set of problems, right? And you're looking for a company because you want to be gainfully employed for a couple of years. And so what if dating was like a test? Is if you Maddie, how much do you make per year? It's what are your hobbies? Okay, interesting. Cool. It's not a test. You to get there, you needed to pass a technical screen. You needed to talk to a recruiter whose job it is to filter out people and filter in a bunch of people. They saw your resume from a sea of resumes or applications, or maybe it came in from a referral. And so by the time you've gotten to an on-site interview, you're pretty much there. It's just this last little bit. And so, yes, there's the test portion, which is the coding and stuff like that. But all the other questions, they're really asking themselves, do I want to work with Maddie? Is she somebody that I could see sitting next to me? And if you come in it with that frame, I think you'll do much better than just being man, I hope I've memorized all of the questions, that they could possibly ask me.
So we all know that getting the job is only the first step. You also have to do well at the job like you did and flourish. How did you survive Amazon's pip culture?
Well, I think, I'll say this just to be brutally honest, if you're a top performer, you do not have to worry about getting pipped. And so just become a top performer.
Sometimes people say maybe politics could play something. Did you ever see any really good engineers just get pushed out because of their manager didn't like them? Or
Yeah, absolutely. So, I think a couple of things here. Whenever you hear the word politics, just replace it with power dynamic. So politics and power exist in any company that you work for. Now, I'm not going to speak to every team at Amazon, but the reality is, if you're a top performer, you can just choose which team you want to work at, and you can just go to a team that's not dysfunctional. And so if you get put on a PIP, you have no freedom of movement. You actually have to stay on that team until you get out of the PIP.
how do you tell if a team will be dysfunctional from the outside? Like, what are some tips?
You can't know for like 6 months because like the way that it works, when you first join a job, a team, whether that's internal or external hire, you have no idea like how the team is dysfunctional, what's good, what's bad. You don't know if a problem's like really going to annoy you. Like, none of these things. So it takes about 4 to 6 months for you to just be like, oh, that's the BS that I need to deal with, right? And so, you can also move before that 6 months is over, right? If you figure out that there's something that's really bad.
Are there any early red flags that you would?
Yeah. So the biggest thing is your manager. Now, if your manager is awesome, then it turns into a virtuous cycle where they're supportive of you, and that makes you want to do good work. And then you do good work, and then you're rewarded for that. And then your manager pats you on the back, and then you're like, wow, this manager is really great. So it's this virtuous cycle. When your manager sucks, they're micromanaging you and they're kind of riding your ass, and you kind of hate doing the work. So you put it off until like the very last second, and then you do poor work. And then now your manager is like definitely going to be like on top of you, and it spirals out into this vicious cycle. And so the biggest thing is really like, what is your manager good? And do you like vibe with your manager? If you have a really awesome manager, that's awesome. You should do that. And so there's not a lot of research literature on the science of like good organizations and good bosses and managers, but what little there is really clear. So basically, people that stay on the same team for many years tend to be better managers. And managers that either like move within an organization or move like many times externally. So like they only stay at a place like 1 or 2 years, and there's just like their whole resume is like that. Those tend to be really bad managers. And so if and when you get an offer, what you should do is you should ask 2 things. 1, how long have you been on the team? Now, if they were reorged in there and it wasn't, any fault of their own, that's totally fine. But you want people generally with longer tenures. The second part that the research literature says is basically good managers keep their best people, because it also, like, the best people, they have choices. And so, you can basically use higher level engineers as a proxy. So how long do people stay with a particular manager? If that's really long, if the senior engineers tend to stay with these people for long periods of time, that's a really good signal. And so if you're moving teams internally, Amazon has this wonderful tech survey that they run every year. And they ask the same set of questions, and they've asked those questions for like 15 years. And so you can like chart a manager's performance year over year. They aggregate up into like senior managers, directors, and VPs. And so you can just take a look at like the general culture. But ultimately, you don't know whether the team is going to be good or bad for about that 6-month period. But at most companies, you can just move teams if that 6-month period is terrible. And they can't put you on a PIP like that early.
So speaking of long tenure, you were at Amazon for 18 years. What finally prompted you to leave Amazon?
Well, I started making YouTube content in 2021 because the part of Amazon that I worked at, which was like live sports, we stopped doing live sports. And so I was like, what do I do with my hands? And so I had all this camera equipment. I like to take pictures. I like to do photography. And so I was like, might as well just try to do this YouTube thing. And so, the channel did really well in the first 2 years. And, that third year, I was basically like, I was making some income, and I was like, I am going to go to my deathbed, and if I stay at Amazon for the rest of my career, I'm really going to regret it. And so I was like, I'm going to particularly regret like not taking a chance on myself and taking a big swing. And so I just reasoned with myself, like, I can just go back to, like, worst case scenario is I go back to Amazon and a bunch of people talk shit about me online. The second worst case scenario is like I go get a better job than Amazon at that level. And so I'm like, I'm okay with those outcomes. But like everything else is like, it's gonna be a really interesting story. Right. So I've been out of Amazon for like 18 months now, something like that. And it's been great. I haven't replaced my income yet. I'm getting pretty close. But in terms of quality of life, I just get to do what I want to. So that's pretty awesome.
That's awesome. Is there something that you did not anticipate after leaving that you now deal with?
Yeah, that's a good question. I was out having beers at the neighborhood bar, and like a bunch of software developers from Amazon sat behind me, and they were just kind of using like Amazon language. So I just was kind of like looking over to see if they like recognized me, and just kind of like leaning backwards to like hear what their conversation was. And I don't know, I just miss like being around software developers and writing code and shipping stuff.
Do people recognize you? Since we are in Seattle and there's a lot of Amazon and a lot of big tech engineers, and you have a really big channel.
Yeah, I mean, it's not that big, but yeah, I get recognized every once in a while, and I think about like Mr. Beast. He's like 1,000 times bigger than me or 10,000 times bigger than me. So like, I have a nice amount of sort of like random conversations with people that recognize me. Like, it's November 2nd today. I took my daughter trick-or-treating. There was somebody that recognized me. Was like walking around. So, but yeah, no, I'm like a D-level celebrity when it comes to YouTube. So not that much.
I mean, I feel like in software engineering, I feel like you're like one of the most recognizable people on YouTube.
Okay. Yeah.
But anyway, yeah. You mentioned that you've been out of Amazon for a while, but recently Amazon announced that they're laying off 30,000 employees. Why do you think that was the case? Was it because of AI or overhiring or any other reason?
I don't know, but what I would say is probably due to overhiring. When you talk about layoffs, like those are actual people, 30,000 or 16,000 or whatever that number is. It's like, that's how many people are affected. That's how many families are affected. And so super terrible situation. But I think ultimately there were like 100,000 corporate employees at the company when I left. If you really like squinted at it, like were those 100,000 people like strictly necessary? Amazon has a history of taking big bets, right? So the idea, at least in Jeff Bezos' time, was we would take a bunch of big bets. The ones that did really well, we would double down on. And then the ones that didn't do well, we should have the courage to cut those and then to move those resources into the bets that are doing well. I think with the layoffs, it's basically they didn't want to redistribute those resources into the other bets. So I don't know. It doesn't seem very Amazonian to me. I think we should have a ton of ideas, especially in this AI age. We should, Amazon should be starting a ton of different businesses. And so, I think fine if you want to cleaver a bunch of features or a bunch of products that weren't working well. I think that's totally an Amazonian thing to do. The real Amazonian thing to do, though, would be to take all of those folks and then redistribute them and then to just really double down on the stuff that is working, because there's a ton of stuff that is working really well at the company.
Last question I have for you. Do you have any regrets or mistakes in your career?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I've made a ton of mistakes. A couple of the big ones, though. One period of time, I didn't really understand that I had a choice when I had a bad manager, right? So, I think I was really naive when I was coming up, and I was like, oh, managers, they're like our parents. Like they must know like right from wrong, and they all must be like really good and coordinate with each other and talk. No, dude, when you get promoted to a manager, like they probably don't even like have extra training for you, right? Like you just kind of get thrown into this managerial role. And so, it's sink or swim. And everybody's got a different style, and it's just not like code. Code, you can just like run unit tests. You can compile it. It'll give you errors. Like for a manager, there's no guidebook. I mean, there are a couple of them, but, you can actually get 3 books on management and they'd be completely contradictory to each other. And so the other insight is like, there are high performing managers and there are low performing managers, just like there are high performing ICs and low performing ICs. And so if you get stuck with a manager that moves around and they're, the good people, end up leaving. I had a bunch of signals that the manager that I was currently with was terrible. And it didn't occur to me that I could just move. I don't know. For some reason, it was just like, oh, like this is what the universe had assigned to me. And so I felt like I just had to deal with it. And so I got reorged anyways, and that person left. But I think every high-level software engineer has a story about sticking it out on a team longer than they should have.
Yeah, I think inertia is really hard to overcome. And yeah, I definitely have stayed at teams longer than I probably should have. Not necessarily because of the manager, but because of the organizational hierarchy. Like I knew that it was going to implode, and it did. Just I didn't want to be there in the implosion.
A lot of the times on the ground floor, like that it's going to implode. You should trust your instincts, right? And so if you don't want to like start preparing for interviews, that's fine. But make sure your resume is good. Make sure you have like a 6-month like emergency fund. Make sure that, you know which expenses you will cut like immediately and which ones you would cut after an extended period of time and which ones are not negotiable. I think that people should have a sort of like layoff emergency kit.
Yeah, so true, especially in 2025 with the market. Thank you so much for chatting with us. This was such an insightful conversation. I learned so much. Where can people find you online?
Yeah, let's see. I have my YouTube channel, so at A Life Engineered, Substack by the same name. And then I have a program where I work with people personally to get higher performance reviews and promotions as quickly as possible. So yeah, I'll give you the link to that if your viewers are interested.
Okay, cool. Thank you so much. I'll see you in the next one.